The winter morning of December 20th, 1943, arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made steel brittle and men's breath form crystals in the air. At Luftwaffe base JG-27 near Oldenburg, Germany, the ground crews had been working since before dawn, their gloved hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the numbing temperature. The war had been grinding on for over 4 years now, and everyone knew the stakes had never been higher. Franz Stigler pulled his leather flight jacket tighter as he walked across the frozen tarmac toward the operations bunker. At 28, he was one of the most experienced pilots in the squadron, with 27 confirmed kills to his name. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, painted in the distinctive desert camouflage from his days fighting over North Africa, sat waiting like a sleeping predator. The aircraft bore the scars of countless battles, but it was meticulously maintained. Stigler demanded nothing less. Inside the briefing room, smoke hung thick in the air as pilots huddled around steaming cups of ersatz coffee. The mood was tense but focused. Major Wilhelm Balthasar stood before a map of northern Germany, his weathered face bearing the weight of command. "Gentlemen, intelligence reports indicate another major American bombing raid forming over England," he announced, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. B-17 flying fortresses, likely targeting Bremen's aircraft manufacturing facilities. "Our job is simple: stop them from reaching their targets and stop them from getting home." Stigler studied the tactical map with the keen eye of a hunter. He knew these routes, these altitudes, these timing patterns. The Americans had become predictable in their daylight precision bombing campaigns, but they were far from easy prey. Their flying fortresses bristled with machine guns, and their fighter escorts had grown increasingly aggressive. As the briefing continued, Stigler's mind wandered momentarily to a conversation he'd had 3 months earlier with his former commanding officer, Gustav Rodel. Rodel had been more than a superior. He was a mentor who had shaped Stigler's understanding of aerial combat and, more importantly, the unwritten codes that governed it. "Franz," Rodel had said during one of their last conversations before his transfer, "remember that we are not just pilots. We are knights of the sky. There is a difference between being a warrior and being a killer. A warrior fights with honor, even in the most desperate circumstances." Those words had stuck with Stigler through every mission since. But today, something felt different. Today, the mathematics of war aligned with personal ambition in a way that made his pulse quicken. 27 confirmed kills. The Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor for bravery, required 28. One more victory. Just one more, and he would join the ranks of the legendary aces whose names would be remembered long after the war ended. Hans-Joachim Marseille, Adolf Galland, Werner Mölders, legends all, and Franz Stigler could stand among them. The briefing concluded with the usual efficiency: Ain weather conditions, clear skies, good visibility, moderate winds from the northwest, expected enemy strength, approximately 200 bombers with fighter escort, tactical approach, hit them hard on the way in, regroup, hit them again on the way out. Stigler checked his watch, 0800 hours. The Americans would likely be crossing the channel within the next 2 hours, their silver forms catching the winter sunlight as they flew in their precise combat box formations. He had seen it countless times before, the geometric beauty of their formations, the way sunlight reflected off aluminum skin and plexiglass canopies. There was something almost artistic about it, if one could forget for a moment that each aircraft carried 10 men and enough explosives to level a city block. As he walked toward his aircraft, Stigler felt the familiar pre-flight ritual take hold. Check the parachute harness, test the radio, review the aircraft systems. His ground crew chief, Oberkreiter Klaus Weber, approached with the morning's technical report. "All systems operational, Herr Oberleutnant. Fuel tanks topped off, ammunition fully loaded, oxygen system checked twice." Weber's efficiency was legendary among the squadron. "She's ready to hunt." Stigler nodded, running his hand along the 109's fuselage. The metal was so cold it burned through his gloves. This machine had carried him through the skies above the Sahara Desert, where the sun could blind a man and the sand could strip paint from aluminum. It had brought him home from the deadly skies over Malta, where Spitfires turned like hummingbirds and the flak was thick enough to walk on. And now, in the frozen skies above Germany, it would either make him a legend or make him a memory. The radio crackled to life across the base. All stations, all stations. Freya radar reports large formation approaching from the west, vector 270, altitude 25,000 feet, approximately 150 contacts. The hunt was beginning. As Stigler climbed into his cockpit, the familiar smell of aviation fuel, Hydraulic fluid and worn leather enveloped him. He had performed this ritual hundreds of times, but today each action felt weighted with significance. The Knight's Cross was more than just a decoration. It was validation, recognition, a tangible proof that his skills and courage had reached the highest levels. His father, a veteran of the Great War, had never spoken much about his service. But Stigler remembered the old man's eyes when Wehrmacht recruiting officers had first visited their small Bavarian town in 1938. There had been pride there, mixed with something else, perhaps worry, perhaps resignation to the cyclical nature of European conflict. Franz, his father had said the night before he left for flight training, "Whatever happens, remember who you are. The uniform may change, but the man wearing it must remain true to his principles." The engine coughed to life with its characteristic roar, the Daimler-Benz DB605 power plant settling into a steady rhythm that Stigler could feel in his bones. One by one, the other aircraft in his flight followed suit, their engines adding to the symphony of mechanical precision that defined the modern air war. As they taxied toward the runway, Stigler caught sight of a group of new pilots standing near the operations building. Young faces, eager expressions, the same look he had worn 5 years ago when the war was still an adventure rather than a grinding test of survival. Some of them wouldn't survive their first 10 missions. It was a statistical certainty that cut through any romantic notions about aerial combat. The control tower cleared them for takeoff, and Stigler felt the familiar surge of acceleration as his 109 gathered speed down the concrete runway. The ground fell away beneath him, and suddenly he was in his element, 3 dimensions of space, unlimited visibility, and the deadly chess match of aerial combat about to begin. At 15,000 feet, climbing through scattered clouds toward their patrol altitude, Stigler allowed himself a moment to appreciate the stark beauty of the winter landscape below. Germany stretched out beneath him like a frosted map, its cities and towns connected by the dark lines of rivers and railways. Somewhere down there, people were going about their daily lives, working in factories, teaching in schools, raising children who would inherit whatever world emerged from this conflict. But up here, in the thin air where contrails marked the passage of warriors, the concerns of the ground seemed distant and abstract. Up here, there was only the immediate reality of hunter and prey, the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, between victory and defeat. The radio crackled again, and its bearing 280 high. Stigler peered through his canopy and spotted them, a formation of dark specks against the winter sky, growing larger as they approached. American B-17 flying fortresses, flying in their classic combat box formation. From this distance, they looked almost peaceful, like a flock of migrating birds following an ancient route across the sky. But Stigler knew better. Each of those aircraft bristled with defensive armament, 50-caliber machine guns in every direction, manned by young Americans who were just as determined to complete their mission as he was to stop them. The mathematics of aerial combat were unforgiving. It would take precise timing, perfect positioning, and more than a little luck to break through their defensive fire and score a killing shot. As his flight maneuvered into attack position, Stigler felt the familiar calm that came with the approach of combat. All the complexities of war, all the moral ambiguities and political considerations, distilled down to this single, pure moment.
Hunter and prey, predator and target.
One more victory, and his name would be inscribed in history. The Knight's Cross was waiting, gleaming like a promise in the winter sunlight ahead. At 25,000 feet above the German countryside, Franz Stigler felt the familiar bite of thin air and sub-zero temperatures seeping through his heated flight suit. The American bomber formation stretched across the winter sky like a mechanical constellation, dozens of B-17 flying fortresses maintaining their disciplined combat boxes with the precision that had made the 8th Air Force both feared and respected. Attacking from high starboard, Stigler radioed to his wingman, banking his Messerschmitt into position. The familiar routine of aerial combat began to unfold, calculate deflection angles, account for relative speeds, choose the optimal approach vector. But something felt different today. The weight of 27 victories pressed against his consciousness like a talisman, each confirmed kill a step closer to immortality. His first pass was textbook perfect. Diving from above and behind, Stigler lined up on a B-17 flying in the high squadron's trailing position. The fortress's defensive gunners opened fire, tracers streaking past his canopy like deadly Christmas lights. He could see the muzzle flashes from the ball turret, the waist guns, the tail gunner's position. 10 scared young Americans, probably not much older than the fresh-faced pilots he'd seen at his own base that morning. Stigler's cannon shells found their mark. He watched pieces of aluminum skin peel away from the bomber's starboard wing, saw smoke begin to stream from one of the engines. But the big aircraft held formation, its pilot fighting to maintain control. Not enough damage, not enough for a confirmed kill. But Tubiel's cannon shells found their mark. He watched pieces of aluminum skin peel away from the bomber's starboard. Banking away from the defensive fire, Stigler climbed for another attack. Through his radio, he could hear the chatter of other German pilots engaging the formation. Hans has one smoking. Watch the Mustangs coming in high. I'm hit, bailing out. The air battle raged around him with the intensity of a violent storm. Contrails crisscrossed the sky, marking the paths of hunters and hunted. Aircraft fell burning toward the earth below, some German, some American, their crews' fates sealed by split-second decisions and the unforgiving mathematics of aerial warfare. On his second pass, Stigler selected a different target, a B-17 in the lead squadron that seemed to be lagging slightly behind formation. As he closed the distance, he could make out individual details, the aircraft's olive-drab paint scheme weathered by countless missions, the distinctive clear nose cone of the lead bombardier's position, even the name painted on the fuselage, Ye Old Pub. The defensive fire was intense but poorly coordinated. These weren't the veteran crews he'd faced over North Africa or in the early days of the bombing campaign. Some of the gunners seemed hesitant, their fire patterns erratic, new crews probably. Men on their first or second mission, still learning the deadly choreography of aerial combat. Stigler's burst of cannon fire walked along the bomber's fuselage, striking the cockpit area and forward section. He saw the plexiglass nose cone shatter, watched control surfaces flutter as hydraulic lines were severed. This time the damage was significant. The B-17 began to lose altitude and fall behind the protection of the main formation. A wounded bomber, isolated and vulnerable, exactly the kind of target that could provide his 28th victory. But as Stigler maneuvered for what should have been the killing blow, something made him pause. The damaged B-17 was barely maintaining level flight, wallowing through the air like a wounded animal. Its defensive guns had fallen silent. "You'll return fire!" No desperate evasive maneuvers, just a slow, inevitable descent toward the earth below. Banking closer, Stigler could see through the shattered nose cone into the aircraft's interior. What he saw made his blood turn cold. Bodies, motionless figures slumped over their positions. The bombardier's station was a chaos of broken plexiglass and twisted metal. In the cockpit, he could make out the pilot, a young man probably not much older than 20, struggling with the controls, his face pale with shock or blood loss. The co-pilot appeared to be unconscious, possibly dead. Through gaps in the fuselage torn by his cannon shells, Stigler glimpsed more carnage. A gunner hung motionless in his harness, his position stained dark with what could only be blood. Another crew member was attempting to tend to a wounded comrade, his movements desperate and futile at this altitude without proper medical equipment. This wasn't a military target anymore. This was a flying tomb carrying 10 young men who were probably going to die whether he shot them down or not. They posed no threat to Germany, no danger to his comrades. They were simply trying to nurse their crippled aircraft home, just as he had done countless times when flak or enemy fighters had damaged his own machine. "Finish him, Franz?" The voice crackled over his radio. His wingman positioning for his own attack run on the straggling bomber. "Easy kill, take him down." But Stigler's hand hesitated on the firing button. In his mind, he could hear Gustav Rodel's voice from their last conversation in North Africa, when his former commander had shared the code that had governed his own aerial combat career. If you see a man parachuting from his aircraft, you do not shoot him. He is no longer a combatant. He is simply a human being trying to survive. The same applies to any pilot in distress, any crew that cannot fight back. Honor, Franz, it is what separates us from murderers. Looking at the shattered B-17, Stigler realized that Rodel's words applied perfectly to this situation. These men weren't parachuting from their aircraft, but they might as well have been. They were defenseless, helpless, clinging to life in a machine that was more coffin than airplane. To attack them now would be no different from shooting parachuting airmen, a violation of the unwritten codes that made aerial combat something more than mere slaughter. But the Knight's Cross, 28 victories, everything he had worked for, everything he had risked his life to achieve, hung in the balance. This was his chance, his moment. The recognition and honor he had dreamed of since joining the Luftwaffe were right there in front of him, requiring only that he press a button and send 10 dying men to their graves a few minutes sooner than fate had already decreed. The internal struggle tore at him like physical pain. His training screamed at him to attack. His ambition demanded he take the shot. His orders were clear: to destroy American bombers by any means necessary. The war effort required it, his comrades expected it. Germany needed every Allied bomber removed from the sky. Franz, what are you waiting for? His wingman's voice was sharp with confusion and urgency. Take the shot. Stigler positioned his aircraft for the perfect attack angle. The B-17 was completely defenseless now, wallowing at reduced altitude, no fighter escort in sight. A 3-second burst from his cannon would tear it apart completely, sending it spinning into the German countryside below. 28th victory. The Knight's Cross. His name inscribed forever among the great aces of the Luftwaffe. His finger found the firing button. The weight of metal and explosive death waited in his guns, ready to be unleashed at the touch of his will. Time seemed to slow as Stigler stared through his gun sight at the wounded bomber. He could see individual crew members moving inside the aircraft, their forms ghostly through the damaged plexiglass and torn aluminum. One of them, perhaps the pilot, turned and looked directly at him through the broken cockpit window. For a moment that stretched across the chaos of war, two pilots made eye contact across the narrow space between their aircraft. In that instant, Stigler saw something that shattered his resolve completely. The American pilot wasn't showing fear or resignation or even defiance. He was showing acceptance. The calm, quiet acceptance of a man who knew he was about to die and had made peace with that fact. It was the look Stigler had seen in mirrors after particularly brutal missions, the expression of someone who had pushed beyond terror into a kind of numb clarity about mortality. This boy, and he was just a boy really, was trying to get his crew home. Just as Stigler had tried to get his own comrades home from countless missions. Just as every pilot in every air force tried to bring his brothers back alive from the killing ground of the sky. Nationality didn't matter in that moment. Politics and ideology and the grand strategic concerns of nations became meaningless abstractions. What mattered was the simple, fundamental recognition of one warrior acknowledging another, one human being seeing his own reflection in the eyes of someone who happened to be wearing a different uniform. "I can't do it," Stigler whispered into his radio microphone, the words barely audible above the engine noise. "What? Franz, what did you say?" His wingman's voice was sharp with confusion. But Stigler wasn't listening anymore. Instead of pressing the firing button, he did something that would have gotten him court-martialed and probably executed if his superiors had known about it. He moved his Messerschmitt into escort position alongside the damaged B-17, close enough that the American crew could see him clearly. The reaction inside the bomber was immediate and predictable. Stigler could see crew members pointing at him, obviously expecting the final attack that would end their lives. But instead of opening fire, he simply held formation, his fighter aircraft keeping pace with the slower bomber. For several long minutes they flew together, hunter and prey, transformed into something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. The German ace and the American bomber crew, temporarily united by the simple recognition of their shared humanity above the artificial divisions of nationality and ideology. But this couldn't last forever. Our German fighters were still in the area, and if they spotted the wounded B-17, they would have no such compunctions about finishing it off. More importantly, German radar installations and anti-aircraft batteries dotted the landscape below. A lone bomber, flying low and slow, would be an irresistible target for every flak gun within range. Stigler made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of the war and beyond. Using hand signals visible through the cockpit windows, he began trying to communicate with the American pilot. First, he pointed north, toward the North Sea and the safety of Allied-controlled airspace. Then he gestured for the bomber to climb, to get above the effective range of ground-based anti-aircraft fire. The American pilot, Charlie Brown, though Stigler wouldn't learn his name until decades later, seemed to understand. The damaged B-17 began a shallow climb, its pilot nursing every bit of performance from the battle-damaged aircraft. Stigler maintained his escort position, his presence serving as a deterrent to other German aircraft that might have been tempted to attack the easy target. As they approached the German coast, flying over the deadly landscape of the Atlantic Wall, Stigler could see anti-aircraft batteries tracking their progress. Gun crews were probably trying to figure out why a German fighter was escorting an American bomber instead of attacking it. Radio chatter was undoubtedly lighting up the German defense network as confused observers tried to make sense of what they were seeing. But nobody fired. The presence of a Luftwaffe aircraft, even in such bizarre circumstances, was enough to stay the trigger fingers of the ground gunners. They flew unmolested over the coastal defenses, heading toward the gray expanse of the North Sea. At the edge of German-controlled airspace, with Allied territory visible on the horizon, Stigler knew his extraordinary escort mission had to end. He couldn't follow the bomber into Allied airspace without risking internment or worse. More importantly, he had already risked everything: his career, his freedom, possibly his life, to help these Americans reach safety. Flying alongside the B-17's left wing, Stigler caught the American pilot's attention one final time. He raised his hand in a formal military salute, a gesture of respect between warriors that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. Charlie Brown returned the salute, his face visible through the shattered cockpit window, his expression mixing gratitude with amazement at the impossible turn of events. Then Stigler banked his Messerschmitt away, turning back toward Germany and whatever consequences awaited him. As he flew south, he could see the B-17 continuing north, gradually disappearing into the haze above the North Sea. Whether the damaged bomber would make it all the way back to England was still uncertain, but at least its crew would have a chance. The Knight's Cross was gone. 27 victories would remain 27. His name would not be inscribed among the legendary aces of the Luftwaffe. But as Stigler flew back toward his base, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years of aerial combat: complete certainty that he had done the right thing. Above the frozen German countryside, a young fighter pilot had chosen honor over glory, humanity over ambition. And in making that choice, Franz Stigler had become something more valuable than an ace pilot. He had become a man who could live with himself. The North Sea stretched endlessly below them, its gray waters reflecting the pale December sky like hammered pewter. Franz Stigler maintained his impossible escort position alongside the wounded B-17, both aircraft flying steadily toward the distant Allied airspace that represented salvation for the American crew and an end to the most extraordinary mission of his combat career. Inside Ye Olde Pub, Charlie Brown fought to keep his aircraft level while processing the surreal reality of his situation. The German fighter that should have destroyed them was instead protecting them, its pilot visible in the cockpit barely 50 meters away. Brown's crew, those still conscious, stared in disbelief at their unlikely guardian angel painted in desert camouflage. Stigler checked his fuel gauge. The escort had already consumed precious fuel that he would need for the return journey to his base. Every minute spent shepherding the Americans farther from German territory was a minute that brought him closer to his own potential disaster, running out of fuel over the North Sea with no friendly airfields within gliding distance. But he couldn't abandon them now.
Not after coming this far.
Not after making the choice that had already cost him everything he thought he wanted. As they crossed into international waters, Stigler began to contemplate the full magnitude of what he had done. When he returned to base, if he returned to base, there would be questions. Where had he gone during the engagement? Why hadn't he reported his 28th victory? Other pilots had seen the wounded bomber. They would want to know what had happened to it. He could lie, of course. Claim the American aircraft had exploded before he could confirm the kill, or that it had escaped into cloud cover. But Franz Stigler had never been comfortable with deception, and the weight of such a monumental lie would be difficult to bear for the remainder of the war. The alternative, telling the truth, was unthinkable. Escorting an enemy bomber to safety was an act of treason that would result in immediate court-martial and almost certain execution. The Luftwaffe had no tolerance for sentimentality, especially not the kind that actively aided the enemy's war effort. But as Stigler watched the damaged B-17 struggling to maintain altitude, its pilot nursing every bit of performance from the battle-scarred aircraft, he felt no regret for his decision. This was what Gustav Rodel had meant when he spoke of honor transcending orders. This was what separated warriors from killers, what made them something more than mere instruments of destruction. The winter sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Stigler spotted the first signs of Allied air activity ahead. Distant contrails marked the passage of RAF Spitfires on patrol, too far away to pose an immediate threat, but close enough to remind him that he was approaching the point of no return. Using hand signals, Stigler caught Charlie Brown's attention one final time. He pointed north, toward the English coast that was still invisible beyond the horizon, but represented the Americans' best hope for survival. Then he tapped his fuel gauge and shook his head, indicating that he could escort them no farther. Brown understood immediately. The young American pilot raised his thumb in acknowledgement, then placed his hand over his heart in a gesture of gratitude that needed no translation. Through the broken cockpit window, Stigler could see tears streaming down the pilot's face, whether from relief, exhaustion, or simple human emotion in the face of inexplicable mercy. For a long moment, the two aircraft flew wingtip to wingtip in the empty sky above the North Sea. German and American, hunter and prey, enemy and friend, All of these labels had become meaningless in the face of something more fundamental. Two young men who understood the terrible mathematics of aerial warfare, who had looked death in the eye countless times, recognizing their shared humanity across the artificial divisions of nationality and ideology. Then Stigler began his turn back toward Germany, banking his Messerschmitt into a gentle arc that would take him home. As he completed the turn, he raised his hand in a final salute, not the rigid Nazi salute demanded by political ideology, but the traditional military salute of one warrior honoring another. Charlie Brown returned the gesture with equal formality, his damaged bomber continuing north as Stigler's fighter disappeared to the south. The brief intersection of their lives was over, but its impact would resonate through the decades that followed. The return flight to his base gave Stigler time to process the magnitude of his decision. He had chosen honor over glory, conscience over ambition, humanity over ideology. In doing so, he had thrown away everything the Luftwaffe valued: the kill count that defined success, the decorations that marked achievement, the recognition that separated legendary pilots from merely competent ones. But as his airfield came into view, Stigler realized he had gained something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that when tested by the ultimate moral choice, he had chosen correctly. Whatever consequences awaited him, he could face them with the certainty that he had remained true to the deepest principles of his upbringing and training. The debriefing was routine. Stigler reported engaging enemy bombers, expending ammunition, and returning without confirmed kills. His commanding officer noted the absence of a 28th victory with mild disappointment, but no suspicion. In the chaos of a major air battle, aircraft frequently escaped without providing definitive proof of their destruction. That night, alone in his quarters, Stigler wrote a letter he would never send to Gustav Rodel. In it, he described the events of December 20th, 1943, and thanked his former commander for the lessons that had guided him through the most important decision of his life. The code of the night had proved stronger than the demands of war. Years passed, the war ground on with its terrible inevitability, consuming nations and generations in its mechanical hunger. Stigler survived, flying, fighting, but never again finding himself in a situation that tested his fundamental principles so clearly. The Knight's Cross remained forever beyond his reach, but he discovered that the loss troubled him far less than he had expected. Germany fell. Third Reich crumbled into history. Franz Stigler, like millions of other German servicemen, found himself in a world that had moved beyond the certainties that had defined his youth. He emigrated to Canada, built a new life, became a successful businessman. But always, in quiet moments, his thoughts returned to that December day when he had chosen mercy over victory. 47 years later, in 1990, two old men met in a hotel lobby in Seattle. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, their hair gray with age, their faces marked by decades of experience, far removed from aerial combat. But when they shook hands, the years collapsed, and they were once again two young warriors who had shared a moment of grace above the North Sea. "I've been searching for you for 40 years, Brown said simply. "I've been waiting for 40 years, Stigler replied. They spent the evening sharing stories, filling in the gaps of their parallel lives, marveling at the chain of circumstances that had brought them together again. Brown described nursing his crippled bomber back to England, the emergency landing that had saved his crew, the decades of wondering about the mysterious German pilot who had spared their lives. Stigler listened quietly, occasionally adding details from his own perspective, but mostly just absorbing the knowledge that his choice had mattered. The 10 young Americans he had escorted to safety had lived full lives, raised families, contributed to their communities. His moment of mercy had rippled through the decades, touching hundreds of other lives in ways he could never have imagined. As the evening ended, both men knew they had been given an extraordinary gift. In a world that had largely forgotten the individual human stories buried within the grand narratives of war, they had been allowed to complete a circle that had begun in violence and ended in understanding. Franz Stigler died in 2008, followed a few months later by Charlie Brown. But their story lived on, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, individual acts of conscience can transcend the hatred and fear that divide nations. In the end, the true victory belonged not to the side that won the war, but to the men who refused to let the war win their souls. The Knight's Cross had never mattered. What mattered was the choice to remain human in the face of inhumanity, to choose honor when honor demanded the greatest sacrifice of all. Above the gray waters of the North Sea, two warriors had discovered that the highest form of victory was knowing when not to fight.